I'll call this special regional council meeting to order. We acknowledge the traditional territories of the Dene and Cree people of Fort Nelson First Nation, whose traditional territory is located at the heart of the Northern Rockies Regional Municipality Administrative Center. We also acknowledge the many Indigenous nations with traditional territory in Northeast British Columbia and the enduring presence of the Métis community. Please be advised that today's meeting is available for the public to attend virtually, is being streamed and recorded. Can I get a motion, please, to adopt the agenda? Moved by Councillor Gerwing, second by Councillor Roper. All those in favor? Carried. Town Square Revitalize or Renewal Project, scenarios for consideration of detailed designs. Mr. Barry.
Sure, thanks, Mayor. So back in August, there was a special meeting where we had quorum, but had a couple of councillors absent. MAE provided Mr. Jack McQuaig provided a presentation regarding the various scenarios, and council at the time elected to defer the decision based on which scenario for detailed design until the absent councils had an opportunity to review the meeting, look at the presentation and whatnot. So the intent today wasn't to, I mean, we could go through whatever council wishes, but we are just hoping that the absent councils had an opportunity to review the meeting and answer any questions you may have. In terms of detailed design, I mean, it's the next step of the process. It's required if to proceed with anything, but it doesn't commit council to doing anything besides it just provides that detailed design to help firm up pricing and scope and phasing and whatnot based on whichever scenario council wishes to go with. Just to quick recap, the scenario one was a very basic read of existing to provide any safety requirements, all walls and whatnot stay in place unless required by code changes and whatnot. Scenario two includes everything scenario one, but it allows some efficiency based on the odd movement of walls and increased efficiency, and it's somewhere in approximately based on the current Class D cost estimate about just over $400,000 more than scenario one. And then scenario three makes a number of different adjustments, provides for a significant amount of requests that occurred by the tenants. It provides some open space that would be left essentially open, completed but open, left open for further development to allow for future expansion and whatnot for the various tenants and those requests based on the presentation that occurred at the time. And that scenario runs over about $4 million approximately versus scenario one. Overall, if you were to push in a bunch of the various options. Based on the discussion we had at the last meeting, my comments were, in terms of affordability, obviously scenarios 1 and 2 are the most affordable from an affordability perspective. Want council to consider, or keep in mind that next year there's quite a likelihood if we maintain existing status quo services based on everything that's occurred this year from increased costs, inflation and whatnot, that we will see an increase most likely next year in costs to operate that's beyond our control, where we've been holding the line fairly well over the past few years. And in terms of affordability with grant funding, scenarios 1 and 2 would be, we're fairly comfortable that we'd be able to do scenarios 1 or 2 with grant funding without having to borrow funds. Scenario 3, even with grant funding, we most likely have to borrow a little bit. Yeah.
So with scenario 1, re-existing and code changes. So that would get us to all the environmental upgrades, the insulation to bring this up, windows, roofs, walls, and it would meet electrical code and access, disability access to the building. That would all be included in scenario 1.
Yes.
And what additional things would be included in scenario 1 besides the insulation, besides the code upgrades?
Well, everything's in there right now, which could be phased. So the roof is in there as part of that price too, because we would include the roof as part of a grant funding request. But for instance, if you didn't have the roof on our dock, on our assessment doesn't require to be replaced for another 7 years or 8 years or something like that. If we didn't receive the grant funding, you can phase that, for example. But the reality is that when you walk into the building, besides, you'd most likely see, because they have the tear apart walls to redo electrical and whatnot, but the building would look essentially the same, and some of the, I'll call it inefficiencies of the building would be the same. Now there's opportunities to scale that essentially, but essentially you just walk in and see a similar building, but you'd have any code changes that are required. Today's code would be done. Accessibility would be done. Fire safety would be looked after. Windows, HVAC, and whatnot.
Any other questions, Mr. Barry? Councillor Andrews.
And then to further onto that, scenario 2 adds those efficiencies. It gives us the same as scenario 1, but then adds in some efficiencies. Since the wall's being opened, we can now move it. And that's where the extra, 400 or 500 grand comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. There's some issue. I mean, that's the one of it is changing the council chambers to have a more efficient, more effective council chambers with appropriate gallery, having office space that's more efficient for the organization, proper meeting spaces and whatnot. But essentially, you summed up quite well, Councillor.
Any other questions, Mr. Barry? Councillor Roper.
So I understand we have the budget for the design phase for this year, correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
How flexible are we? Like once that's complete, do we have a deadline to proceed with the project or not proceed with the project? How long are those estimates good for?
Like anything, and that's a very good question and a very hard answer. Only because the volatility right now of what's occurring, right? I mean, we got estimates for projects last winter that were blown out of the water this summer with delivery and challenges, right? So like anything, the minute it's printed, it's out there. That said, you do build a bit of contingency in. In regard to timing, there's no commitment once you do the detailed design when you start the project. I think you just realize and keep in mind that the longer the project's delayed, there's a likelihood that costs will increase over time, right? If you delay it for however long, months or years or whatever will be the price will eventually go up, because it's our experience that none of it goes down.
Councillor Roper.
Thank you. Just to follow up, you mentioned at the last meeting that I missed that there was a possibility we might have to borrow. What are the procedures for consulting with the public if we were to proceed, if we did need to borrow, if we're spending out of those reserve accounts? I mean, at some point, those reserves were levied off the taxes in previous years. How far do we need to go with public consultation and the approval process for that?
If we borrow, we need to go to referendum. Anything over $1 million, because we have a bylaw and allowance to borrow within $1 million, and that's that request that goes back to council annually, just provide some borrowing abilities just for cash flow and whatnot. But the reality is that anything over that amount, we would require to go to referendum or alternate approval process, which is a whole nother avenue itself. And
Councillor Roper.
I seem to recall, I think during the 2014 election, there was some sort of question regarding town hall upgrades. I think there was an approved amount, thinking it was maybe $2 million or something. Can you give me some context behind that? And if that went through, and if that can still be carried through with our considerations today?
I have to check into that one, because I don't know, Jay, if you can comment on that one. I remember that was part of a process. I think it was linked in with the rec center and some work with the airport, but I'd have to go back and take a look, Councilor, if I don't have anything specific to that.
Thank you.
Under scenario 1 and 2, how much grant funding would we be eligible for?
What's the number, Sean? About $6 million max. Yeah.
Without putting too fine a point on it, $6 million.
Right now, 100,000 or a little, a bunch of small ones that we can look at.
Okay. And the 6 million, is that a fairly assured thing, or is this depending on whether we get it? And that would depend on, so a council approves spending here with the understanding we're going to be getting 6 million. If we don't get the 6 million, it may change council's mind here.
So I would not go into this assuming that you'd get a grant. I mean, there's a likelihood we'll see some grant funds come our way, but we would not want to go into it making an assumption we're getting grant funds, Mayor. There's a likelihood if we got 0 grant funds, we'd possibly have to borrow for scenarios 1 or 2. Depending on when we did the projects, because certain things could be phase 2, and that's all part of that detailed design. When you look at it, we would tend to bring in a construction manager to assist with the detailed design so they can look at efficiencies as part of the detail, the build and whatnot. So in terms of the grant funding, we're going to continue to look. There's couple of applications, one for sure, and now anyway, that's in council approved here a while back. But again, we can't assume anything. The thing just to remember is that just by going to a detailed design, you're not committed to proceed with the project, right? Or there's no timeline, with the exception of you can always, as part of a detailed design, to your question, Councilor Roper, if it sat on a shelf for a year or 2 years or whatever that number is, or if you did a portion of it that was required to say, if you did windows and whatever that might be, you can always circle back and refresh those numbers in terms of your cost, if it's at, right? But at this point, yeah, like I said, with 1 and 2, we're comfortable that we think we're on the cusp that we have the ability to fund that one, especially if it was spread out over a little bit of time and phase. Scenario 3, even with the grant funding, we think that based on where we are from a financial perspective and the volatility of the prices, or pricing and what we've been seeing, that we would have to borrow no matter what. We just don't have the funds in the reserves to look after that.
Now, the grant funding, although it's not a sure thing, we are meeting the criteria for a lot of those grants, or we appear to be meeting the criteria.
Yep.
So we have a good prospect that we might be eligible for a large portion of that.
Yeah, I mean, we communicate with people within the ministry and people who assist us with the grant applications and things like that. You gotta keep in mind also, at times, even though you tick all the boxes, grant funds usually have a limit in terms of what the total value of funds are available, so they could be oversubscribed. And we, in the past, have not been successful with grants, not because the application didn't meet the criteria, it's because it's been oversubscribed and someone's either met it better than us, or at the same time, they look back and look at history in terms of who's received grants and when, and say, okay, Northern Rockies received this grant or similar grants in the past. We'll direct these funds somewhere else.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Barry? Councilor Roper.
Just one more. There is the potential for the tenants to also apply for some of the same grants or different grants. Are we eligible? Can the building receive the same grant from 2 different organizations? How would that work?
It depends on the grant mechanism, right? And if we apply for a grant that has the same scope, I'll pick on the theater. So say if there was a certain scope of work in the theater that we applied for a grant for, the theater wouldn't be able to, society wouldn't be able to apply for that exact same scope of work with the same grant funding, right? Because that's essentially double dipping, right? But sometimes you have the ability to overlap grants, depending on scope, especially depending if they're coming from different funding mechanisms, but it's just dependent on the criteria of the grant. So it's hard to say. The short answer is yes, the societies or the tenants do have the ability to apply for grant funding.
Any other questions for Mr. Barry? Hearing none. Any further comments, Mr. Barry, on this?
Nothing, I'll just reach out to Jay, Sean, Harv's just kind of getting his feet wet and reviewing a bunch of information on this one, but anything you guys have to add?
I took a quick look back to 2014, and the referendum question was regarding the community health center. And ultimately the referendum was canceled. It didn't go through with the election because the alternate approval process for that project was unsuccessful. And following that, council of the day opted not to go through the expense of a referendum, and the project didn't proceed. So from what I can see, there was no questions asked of the public around the town square facility. I do believe that in past years, there was a question posed to the electors around the proposed public safety building. But as we recall, that did not proceed either. So there have been past budgets established for town square, and we did have some preliminary work done probably 7 or 8 years ago around fire and life safety. But by far, McQuaig's work in 2019 was the most detailed assessment of the building. And we didn't have any other designs. This would be the first opportunity for design for this.
Councillor Penny.
Originally looking at all our scenarios, my preference was for scenario 3, just to utilize this building the best we could and leave room for expansion and that sort of thing. But looking at it and speaking with Mr. Barry, and it looks like it's a far reaching thing that we could ever get to the point that we can afford this without putting a huge burden onto the taxpayers. So, but at the same time, this building is going to start to cost significant amounts of money to the taxpayers very soon. So we do need to get moving on something. And that's why I feel that scenario 2 would probably be about the best of both worlds for us right now. And yeah, that's what I said.
Councillor Andrews.
I'm kind of leaning that way too, Councillor Penny. When we first started this, looking at the building, my biggest concerns was the safety, accessibility, and the efficiency of the building. And I think option 2 gives us our best options for that. I would, if Councillor Penny wasn't making that motion, I'd make a motion for option 2.
I just want to hear from Mr. Shaughnessy here before we entertain any motions. Mr. Shaughnessy, any comments on this at all?
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. No, no comment specific to the project, just the fact that, like Mr. Barry said earlier, we're just trying to get a decision on which way to design. There's no commitment to anything. It's just the design that we're trying to get to, which will help us narrow down the numbers and give council a better idea of what we're looking at for long term.
Thank you. Councillor Roper.
And I just want to take into consideration, I guess there's a scenario that we could consider 2.5 almost, which would be to designate the extra space, but not fully complete that. What kind of cost savings could we have from integrating scenario 3 as a future possibility, but not going through with it right now?
So in Mr. McQuaig's presentation back in August for this originally, he had kind of touched on that and the fact that we could definitely create the space and leave it sitting vacant. 2 points to that will be that for however long it's left vacant, the public will be coming in. One of the biggest pieces will be the front lobby, and they'll just be seeing this blank canvas and nothing would change. The other part about that will be the cost to develop it in the future, specific to whatever use it's going to be. We could bring the HVAC to those points. We could bring the electrical to those points, but then when we develop them specific for the tenants, changes have to be made to what's already existing and we've already done to upgrade to make everything function properly for those. So there would be additional cost in the future, and that cost depending on the volatility of the market, and that could be higher, it could be lower.
And the scope.
I might, sorry,
Councillor Penny.
if I'm not mistaken, I do believe that it didn't reduce the cost significantly. There would still be a bunch of additional costs for the scenario 3 or 2.5, whatever you want to call it. There was still going to be significant cost increases over scenario 2, leaving future costs unknown as well. So.
All right. Is there any more comments on this? Is Councillor Schultz?
I just, I met a lawyer at UBCM who would, yeah.
How
I met-
unfortunate, Councillor
Yes,
Schultz.
and it was at the reception, so nothing was official, but he said, do you still have that big plywood table in the council chambers? I said, oh, yes. He said, man, don't let him get rid of that. Yeah, you got the nicest council table in the province. Anyway, that was at a reception, so I couldn't, he's one of our lawyers. Anyway. He does.
So, council, here's the question. Are we prepared to vote on this now? I don't know that there's any more questions we have to ask. Are we prepared to go forward here and come to a decision on this?
I certainly am.
Very well. So I'm going to start by going to scenario 3 and asking the question. And if we get a mover and seconder, we'll move to scenario 2 and then we'll move to scenario 1. So do I have a motion for scenario 3?
I would make the motion for scenario 3.
Do I have a seconder for Councillor Roper's motion? Seeing none, that motion dies. For scenario 2, do I have a motion? Motion by Councillor Penny. Do I have a seconder for that motion? Seconder, Councillor Andrews. All those in favor of scenario 2? And that motion passes unanimously. You can't have one if you had to. Very well. I think our meeting now is at a conclusion and therefore I will declare this meeting adjourned.